session, all of you. My name is Rita Costa Gomes, and I am a member in the history department here at Towson University. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Benjamin Fisher, our speaker today. Dr. Fisher is my colleague in history, and he will talk to us today about his recently published volume with the very beautiful title, Amsterdam's People of the Book. So Dr. Fisher is a wonderful colleague and also, what is more important for us today, a historian of 17th century Europe. And this is what he is going to talk about today to all of us. He made his studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he got his PhD. Dr. Fisher's main focus as a historian, as a scholar, is on social and intellectual and cultural history and history of Europe. And he brings his expertise in the study of Jewish societies in different European contexts to illuminate different aspects of the past in Europe, in particular in intellectual history. His expertise, as I said, in different European contexts, not only the north of Europe, but also in the Iberian Peninsula, in Italy, so in a southern European context. All of that material he brings into this wonderful study that he did of the Jewish community of Amsterdam in the 17th century, reaching back also to the later medieval period and focusing mostly on early modern times and early modern subjects of scholarship. He has centered his attention in the book in Amsterdam. But what I want to highlight here is that his reach and his breadth of scholarship goes well beyond this fascinating city in the 1600s, because Amsterdam was obviously a very cosmopolitan capital of the intellectual world of Europe in the 17th century. So before I pass the word to Dr. Fisher, let me tell you a little more about this book and how reading it may challenge some of the ways that you think about 17th century Europe. Because I insist this is a book for all of us to read, not only people interested in Dutch history or in the history of Amsterdam or in Jewish history. One of the successes of this book, at least one of the joys that I had in my reading of it, is the wonderful way in which Dr. Fisher integrates and completes the intellectual history of the Sephardic Jewish community of Amsterdam with a social history of its educational institutions, of its communal life, a social history of the book and of reading, and a history of its libraries. So it is a very striking aspect of the book. It's the way that he opens his book, and this kind of roots his analysis of the ideas and the arguments of these scholars in a wonderful way. And it kind of brings to us a daily dimension, and the roots of all these debates are very clearly set in the society, in Jewish society of Amsterdam in this period. It was especially interesting to me to see so well described the way that books were gathered, the way that books were collected, the way that books were used by Jewish intellectuals of Portuguese and Spanish ancestry and roots, who were using the vernaculars of Iberia on a par with other scholarly languages, of course. We know of the dispersal of the books that accompanied the expulsion first from Spain, then from Portugal, and the inquisitorial persecution leading to the disappearance and loss of so many manuscripts and early printed books. But Dr. Fisher's study helps us see, almost like in a kaleidoscopic way, the way that libraries were constantly being formed and transformed by what was available to these scholars, by what these extraordinary readers, such as, for instance, and scholars such as, for instance, Saul Levi Morteira, what they were passionate about, what they were eager to read. So we are put in this world of scholarly interests, which is largely a world of books and a world of libraries, and guided in this world by his very knowledgeable hand. A second direction that I thought was particularly interesting in Dr. Fisher's work was how he unveils and he explains the use of history as a discipline in the 17th century, and how historical methods and historical questions were brought into the discussion of sacred texts in the context of 17th century Amsterdam. So how history becomes a tool for modernity, even before Spinoza. In fact, largely setting the stage in this community for later and more radical arguments and ideas that are going to emerge in the Dutch 17th century context and find important resonance elsewhere, not only in Holland, but also in France, in England, and so on. One last thing that I'd like to say, and that is Dr. Fisher has a talent for clarity. His prose is limpid and vivid, and he explains complex theological arguments in this book in a way that it makes it possible for us to follow very complicated subjects. Because this book is also about ideas, and it's about 17th century texts, which are always difficult to read and to interpret. But his capacity to put it in such an accessible way for all of us readers without theological or philosophical training is truly another reason for all of us to explore this book and follow Dr. Fisher's evocative portrait of Amsterdam's discussions about biblical scholarship, about chronology and history, about science and religion. It's also a story about tradition and intellectual ambition. And you don't have to take my word for it, of course, because you're going to read the book yourselves. So thank you, Ben, for this beautiful book, and congratulations. And I'm going to pass the word now to you. And before you start, however, I'm going to say to everybody that I'm going to be doing the moderation of this debate. So I would ask you all, if you have questions, please write them in the chat so that we can proceed with the debate after Dr. Fisher's presentation. To you, Ben.
Thank you so much for the kind and exaggerated introduction, Rita. It's a great honor to have you as part of this event, because the department as a whole has been so supportive and collegial, and you have been such a wonderful intellectual partner in many different junctures with this book. Can folks hear me okay?
No,
it's all jumbled. It's bad sound.
Oh, let's try this. Let me try this.
that's good.
Is this better?
Much better.
Okay. I was just saying, thank you. I was thanking Rita for her wonderful and exaggerated introduction, and for being part of such a supportive and collegial department at Towson, which made it a joy to work on Amsterdam's People of the Book. The book overall, as Rita, as Dr. Costa Gomes indicated, is about a unique Jewish community that emerges in Amsterdam. Let me just share my screen here. As I'm getting started here. The book is about a, from the beginning. There we go. A unique Jewish community that emerges in Amsterdam. The book is about a, from the beginning. There we go. A unique Jewish community that emerges in Amsterdam in the years of the 1600s that for the time period has an extremely atypical focus, even an obsession on the Bible as a feature of their children's education, of their adult education, of their leisure activities, of their rabbinic thought and scholarship. Compared to the wider Jewish world of this time period, it is extremely atypical. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is bringing together different parts of the book into a presentation on how the Protestant world of this time period helped give shape to the way that Amsterdam's Jews thought about the Bible, read the Bible, and used it as a religious and cultural resource. And just at the outset, I would stress that this pertains both to the way that Amsterdam's Jews read the Jewish Bible, as well as the way that they read the New Testament and thought about Christianity. And so this is Amsterdam's Jews are made up of immigrants from Spain and Portugal who are descendants of conversos, of forced and reluctant converts to Christianity. And this Christian background forever colored their perspectives and activities. So a little bit about the origins and geography of Amsterdam's Jews. Why Amsterdam? We're going to talk about a little bit. And then the Protestant factor that comes into play so powerfully, I argue. And when we look at the Protestant factor, we're going to be looking at two different lines of conversation. We're going to see what happens when Amsterdam's Jews meet and encounter Protestants who sound like Jews but are not. And then second, we're going to see how the Protestant world that this community lived in began to see the Bible as a book of errors, one that needs to be reconciled, no doubt, errors that need to be explained, inconsistencies that need to be explained, but nevertheless, a perspective on the Bible and its as a fundamentally inconsistent text, a fundamentally contradictory text that sets the stage for modern doubts and uncertainties about the authority of the Bible. Are we still good on sound?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So in the early 1600s, there was no real permanent Jewish community in Amsterdam, Ashkenazi, French or German, or Polish, or Sephardi, Iberian. By 1675, you have a highly developed, flourishing Jewish community. And so immediately the question of origins is apparent. Where on earth did these folks come from, in other words? And it's not a straightforward question. Why come to Amsterdam at all? There's no established Jewish community there. If you are a kind of religious refugee from Spain, there's literally nothing to say that Amsterdam is where you want to go. In fact, in the Netherlands, there is a hostility towards Spain and all things Hispanic that is just off the charts because Spain was the former imperial power controlling the Belgium and today's Netherlands. And there are plenty of alternatives from Istanbul to Salonika to Venice, Ferrara, Padua, Bordeaux, where there are established communities of Jews and conversos, where people could go. But they didn't. They went to Amsterdam. And when they did go to Amsterdam, they established themselves very quickly. This is a 17th century map of the early Jewish architecture and settlement in Amsterdam. If you go to Amsterdam today, if these travel restrictions and the dystopian pandemic ever fade away, you will be able to visit many of these places. The magnificent synagogue is over here. Don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you can, it's sort of over to the far left where the famous canals that you can walk along today are located. I like to think of the map as being sort of centrally peripheral. The Jewish community was clearly at the beginnings on the periphery of the city, but never more than a few minutes walk, literally, from some of the main commercial and political institutions of the city. So this is where the synagogue today of the Portuguese Jews is located. They established opulent houses. We're talking about many emigres from Spain and Portugal who are extremely wealthy. This is the Pinto House on the Jodenbraestraat in Amsterdam, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the Rembrandt House, where the famous Dutch artist lived. And this is the Portuguese synagogue that is ornately designed to look like the way that Solomon's temple in Jerusalem was imagined, and can also be visited today. And its interior, all original wood and chandeliers. Much of the wood, especially for the ark at the front, where the Torah scrolls are kept, imported from Brazil. And at Towson, we have a wonderful book of sermons in the rare book collection, which is fantastic, that actually has the requisition for the building materials for this in the handwritten pages of Amsterdam's rabbis. It's really a remarkable artifact. So even though Amsterdam was not an obvious place, it was actually a rather logical place for religious emigres to go. Economically, it was a really great place to make money in the 17th century as a major hub in the Atlantic economy. Politically, after there's a rebellion against Spain that leaves the Dutch an independent state. The rebellion begins in the early 1570s, and by 1609, it's sort of more or less official. Even the Spanish de facto recognized Dutch independence. And so for people fleeing Spanish oppression, it is a natural choice of the persecuted. And in fact, one of the people I'll be speaking about today, Rabbi Menachem ben Israel, stressed in a magnificent sermon that he gave, perhaps a bit audaciously, before the Prince of Orange, the leading figure of the Dutch monarchy or royal family, and the leading members of the English monarchy. He stressed that shared experience of the Inquisition united Dutch Jews and Dutch Christians, and emphasized that he and members of his community no longer hold Spain and Portugal, but Holland to be their fatherland, to be their fatherland. There's a deep Jewish identification with the Netherlands here. Now, scholarship on the Spanish and Portuguese Jews has naturally focused to a large degree on the Hispanic heritage that they brought with them and that they deliberately cultivated. They called themselves men of the Nassau, men of the Portuguese nation. They were proud of their Portuguese blood and ancestry. They limited membership in their prestigious confraternities and societies, full membership, to people who had literally Portuguese blood. Their literature and political thought and religious ideas and Bibles are Hispanic in so many different ways that have been so deeply studied. But at the same time, we can't escape that they're living in the Netherlands. They're friendly with Dutch intellectual luminaries of the time period, Hugo Grotius, Isaac Vossius, many others. Beginning with Menosha, many of the leaders of this community are born and raised in Amsterdam. It would be bizarre if there were not a Protestant influence. We would really have to contort ourselves intellectually if we were to argue that there was not. And so my subject today is, how does this bear out, this Protestant influence? And specifically, how does the Dutch Protestant world of the 1600s shape Spanish Jews living in the Netherlands and their attitudes toward the Bible? And to do that, we're going to be looking at two figures. We're going to be looking at Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, and we're going to be looking at Rabbi Menachem ben Israel, who I mentioned briefly already. And we are actually going to start with Saul Levi Mortera and his changing views of the New Testament and Christianity, which transform remarkably and powerfully over the course of his life. And as we're going to see, the fulcrum of this change and transformation is his physical encounter with Protestants in the Netherlands and with the books of the Protestant communities that circulated at this time and the ideas. So Mortera is a Venetian. He actually is of Ashkenazi, of Franco-German descent. But he was a close friend of a Sephardi rabbi or a Sephardi merchant who traveled to Paris in 1612. And then died. And Mortera brought his body in 1616 to Amsterdam, where he was buried. This was the closest Jewish cemetery. And Mortera was quickly hired to teach in the school system. And he established himself as one of the leading rabbis of the community, a teacher, and a scholar of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. I mentioned before, the New Testament is something that these Jews, Spanish and Portuguese Jews, grew up with and were raised in, and it was a focal point for them, and it never ceased to be a focus of their lives. It was not something that they could ignore. Mortera's attitudes towards towards the New Testament start off in the 1630s as a young leader of the community, hostile, venomous, dismissive, sarcastic, nothing nice to say. Regarding the verse in Matthew, for instance, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. Mortera caustically remarks, and this explicitly contradicts Leviticus, "You shall not defile your souls with any animal that moves along the ground." And crucially, you can just see the sarcasm dripping from Mortera as he says, "And what exactly was the sin that defiled Adam, held so dear by the Christians, other than contaminating himself through the mouth?" Likewise, Mortera's early comments in the 1630s on Matthew 5:21. "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is even angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, Rasha, wicked, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says you fool will be in danger of hell. Mortera, again, sarcastic. I ask, according to these precepts, who is there among all of the Christians who could be saved? And how do they have the temerity to call the law of Moses heavy? Those who have in their own law such heavy precepts? Now, when we turn our attention to Mortera very helpfully for us, returned to these same New Testament passages at the end of his life, literally in his dying days. In 1660, but his perspectives could not be more different. So looking first at this verse in Matthew, later on, Mortera has this to say, nor is it possible to say that the precepts related in Matthew are new precepts, because closely considered, some of them are precepts of the law of Moses, and some are enhancements of observances. All of these are precepts of the law of Moses because the prohibition against getting angry accords with the verse, you shall not take revenge. And the prohibition against calling your neighbor wicked or crazy accords with another biblical verse. There is no difference except in the penalty. And the difference of penalty is not a difference of precepts. So instead of sarcastic dismissal, now we have finding common ground and areas of overlap. So too with the question of whether eating impure foods defiles or not. Mortera had this to say when he revisited this passage in Matthew at the end of his life. This is in reference to what goes into one's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of one's mouth. In 1660, Mortera cites a New Testament passage from Acts that contradicts this. In Acts, it says, "It appears good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to place upon you a burden except this. You shall abstain from food sacrificed to idols and blood and strangled animals." So, in other words, it does seem from the New Testament that there are foods that you're supposed to avoid. All of these things, Mortera writes, enter through the mouth and are prohibited because they defile. And this is the crucial passage for Mortera. It is possible to respond that in no way do these words intend to make licit everything that can enter through the mouth that is prohibited by the law, but rather what it says is relatively that which exits the mouth defiles the soul more than what enters the mouth. Again, finding common ground, overlap, shared agreement between Judaism and Christianity. The mechanism that causes this transformation, as Mortera himself writes, is a discourse that took place more than 25 years ago, so approximately in the mid-1630s. Mortera writes, "Here I am reminded of a memory of a discourse that took place more than 25 years ago with an old, very learned and peaceful man who, while talking with me, said that there was very little difference between us and you. I replied to him, 'How can you say this when we believe in a single pure unity and they believe in a trinity?' He responded that in no way do they believe in such things and that everything beyond him, that is Jesus, was created. I was astonished to hear this," Mortera says, "for this was the first of these novos reformados, who are commonly called Socinians, with whom I had ever spoken in my entire life, nor had I taken notice of this confession. Thus I asked if he was not a Christian, since he did not confess the Trinity. He said that yes, he was a Christian, and that he believed in that man, Jesus, as a creation and not as the creator, and that Jesus was the most perfect being that God ever created. I asked if he believed in the Gospels, and he replied that he did." So Mortera's discovery of these radical Protestants who reject the Trinity changed his understanding of Christianity and the New Testament, and inspired him to move from this venomous hostility toward Christianity in the New Testament, toward emphasizing common ground between Judaism and Christianity. And especially, Mortera was driven to show that even Jesus never ceased to be a loyal rabbinic Jew. And to make this case, he chooses to discuss a passage where Jesus is actually rebuked and scolded by the Pharisees for seeming to violate Jewish law. In Matthew 12, it says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath.'" As somebody trying to find common ground, this bothered Mortera. He actually tries to resolve the problem and exculpate Jesus, get Jesus out of hot water. And the way he does this is by drawing on the insight of a Spanish Protestant that he had been reading, Cipriano de Valera, who suggested that the Sabbath described here was not the weekly Jewish Sabbath where all work is prohibited, but a Sabbath that is part of the second day of observance of another Jewish holiday where it actually is permitted to work. And so drawing on this insight, Mortera writes that the disciples picking heads of grain on the second day of another festival and eating them would not be a violation of a biblical law, but only a transgression of one of the rabbinic fences around the law. Something in his view less serious. So Jesus in this vision can remain a loyal rabbinic Jew. So Mortera spent his life immersed in the Protestant Reformation, living in the Netherlands. He moves from hostility to reassessment of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. And he does so because he is a reader of Christian literature, but we can never underestimate the importance of human interactions and chance exchanges that happen. Mortera, incidentally, is not enamored with every member of the different Protestant groups that he bumps into in the Netherlands. He has another encounter with a Quaker that actually he becomes very unnerved and terrified, and ends the conversation and runs away. And we can get to that later. But with the anti-Trinitarian Christians, Mortera was captivated. Okay, so let's pause a moment and shift gears. And shift our attention to the Jewish Bible in the Protestant world. And Menosha ben Israel. And here I'm going to be talking about Menosha ben Israel's most maybe original type of work, the Reconciler, the Conciliador, what he described as a new work never developed by another of our nation, of our nación. And what the Conciliador is this multi-volume effort to reconcile every single identifiable contradiction and inconsistency in the Bible, cover to cover. Thousands upon thousands of different biblical verses we're talking about here. Menosha even counted them once, in an effort to prove that the Bible is infallible, is unerring. More on that in a little bit. Now, biblical contradictions are nothing new to rabbinic literature. They go back to the Talmud, and and Jewish thinkers have talked about them individually throughout the ages. But the Conciliador really does stand out, and Menashe really is correct in one sense in emphasizing that this was a new work, never done by another member of the Nación. And that is in the fact that this is the first Jewish book entirely devoted to these contradictions, cover to cover, to identifying and resolving biblical contradictions. And indeed, Menashe wrote 4 volumes spread over 20 years, covering almost his entire adult life. So this was, I mean, if ever there was something that you could describe as somebody's obsession, this was his obsession. And it really demands that we ask how this genre of literature entered into the Jewish repertoire. And the answer is that this type of literature might have been completely absent from Jewish history, but it was not absent from Christian history, and especially Protestant history in the 16th and 17th centuries. There are numerous examples of Protestant authors writing books reconciling contradictions in the New Testament and the Gospels. Martin Bucer, Andreas Osiander, John Calvin, the famous scholar, and of course, the memory train is failing me right now. Joseph Scaliger was a reconciler of verses, the contradictory verses. All of these figures sharing the belief that reconciling contradictions proves infallibility, proves the unerring character of the Bible, and infallibility proves divinity for Jews as well as Christians. Now, for Menashe and his book full of errors, even the tiniest little seemingly insignificant contradiction could throw the sanctity of the Bible into question. As an example, he considers the Bible's statement that the Israelites ate manna in the desert for 40 years, and then he calculates that he can only come up with 39 years and 11 months. And this is a crisis for him that must be reconciled. I'm going to be speaking more today about the second volume of the Conciliador, published in 1641, which I call the mathematical volume, because it's here that Menashe deals with numerical and chronological contradictions in the Bible, especially how long the time period between the exodus from Egypt and the construction of Solomon's temple. That's number one. And then number two, how long the kings of Israel and Judah ruled. And the crucial question, what if we can't resolve the problems? What happens if you can't resolve numerical inconsistencies in the Bible? I focus particularly on the numerical inconsistencies here in Amsterdam's People of the Book, because there's a special poignancy if these specific types of contradictions cannot be reconciled. You cannot hide from them in the same way that you can hide from or easily reconcile a spiritual contradiction or moralistic contradiction. Numbers are numbers, and so what if the numerical problems can't be solved? To start, the problem of the duration of time between when the Israelites left Egypt and the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. It's supposed to be a 480-year period. Nice, neat 480 years. 300 years from the conquest of the region of Heshbon after the Exodus until the prophet Yiftach or Jephthah, And then another 180 years from the time of Jephthah to the construction of Solomon's temple. These are clear statements of time in the Bible, and it adds up to 480 years. Menosha's problem, and he's not alone in realizing this, is that if you calculate all the data in the Bible, you come up with 576 years. And here you're calculating you're adding together all the reigns of the individual judges that govern Israel, and it comes up to this wildly larger number. And it's compounded by the fact that some of the judges, really, the dates aren't actually all that clear. So what do you do with this? How do you square 576 years back down to 480 years? Well, here's a graph depicting just how kind of monumental this numerical challenge is. You've got the individual calculations and you've got the biblical signposts. Quite a difference. So the major medieval biblical commentator, Jewish biblical commentator, Isaac Abravanel, was a realist about this. And said, don't take Yiftach's 300 years literally. In reality, it's only a period of 268 years. And Abravanel, in a statement that may make us squirm a little bit ourselves today, but nevertheless, medieval people are medieval. When scripture says or testifies that something happened in such and such a way, it must be accepted precisely in the form described. However, this is not so in exchanges between some men and other men, and much less so in those of Israel and the Gentiles, in which each man speaks in the manner he sees fit. Just as here Jephthah, in order to secure his rights to his lands, sent ambassadors to testify that he had possessed them for many years. And he said 300, even though the truth was that it was 268. It's a very modern, the kind of sort of flexibility and reasonableness of Abravanel is refreshingly, I think, modern. And, we can sympathize with him in a lot of ways. It makes sense to us. But to Menosha, this wouldn't fly at all. Menosha lived in a world where, shaped by these Protestant perspectives on the infallibility of the Bible, no error of any size was tolerable. And there's other things as well. It's a world that we can get into the discussion later if people want to. This is also an era where the early scientific revolution was sort of identifying areas in scripture that seemed to conflict with some of the recent scholarly scientific discoveries. And so people are kind of uniquely, especially sensitive to even tiny apparent errors in the Bible. Galileo's heliocentric universe is an especially controversial one in the Netherlands of this time period. But I'm going to stay more focused for the time being. So Menosha does his best to try to reconcile this mathematical problem here. He tries to add up all the biblical numerical information as best he can, but he still has prophets that have no dates associated with them. So he sort of moves the numbers around arbitrarily to make the 576 years down to 480. He says, again, arbitrarily, that we can just chop off all of the years where Israel was ruled by a foreign territory. But it still doesn't make the numbers work. And even if it did, Menosha knew that he was playing fast and loose with the data. And he confessed his dissatisfaction with what he had accomplished. He says, although in this way we have not achieved more insight than through reason, it will be sufficient for us here in order to discern that there is no fault in the authority of the divine letters. We have not achieved more insight than through reason. Menosha did not conclude any degree of confidence in what he had accomplished here. The same, we shall see, is true for what he described as the greatest problem that there is in Scripture. The greatest problem that there is in Scripture, Menosha, and I should add many Protestants and Catholics before him, had observed is that if you count the length of years ruled by the kingdom of Israel, according to the kings of Israel, you get 241. But if you count the duration of the kingdom of Israel according to the kings of Judah, you get 261. Not as big of a difference as before, but nevertheless, a difference that should not be in an infallible Bible. So we have the kings of Israel counted according to their own. We have the kingdom of Israel according to the years ruled by its own kings, and those of the kings of Judah. And you get a different number, 241 versus 261. Now, bear in mind that Menosha has spent a huge amount of time and ink laying out this problem. When you learn that he then concludes, it is not my intent for the moment to examine these opinions and air out this material, for it would take a very long discussion. However, if God will grant me life, I hope to do this in a separate book on chronology and the succession of the times. He just writes off his responsibility of solving the problem that he has just laboriously exposed to the world. He does nothing to solve it. Now, some of you may know already that one of Menachem ben Israel's and Saul Levi Morter's contemporaries in Amsterdam was Benedict Spinoza, born 1632 and died 1677. And in Amsterdam's People of the Book, at a number of junctures, I show that understanding the biblical culture, the way that Amsterdam's traditional Jews saw the Bible, is essential for understanding how Spinoza becomes one of the most radical European philosophers who challenges the way that everybody sees the Bible. And one of the devices that Benedict Spinoza seizes upon in order to make the case, in order to tear down the traditional way of viewing the Bible and to construct his own critical alternative approach to reading the Bible, is to exploit the Bible's internal contradictions. And he writes in a number of instances many other discrepancies, such as that he cites the same contradictions about the chronology of the judges and the kings of Israel and Judah. And he says many other discrepancies such as this are evident throughout the Bible. And I certainly do not need to review the maneuvers of those writers who try to reconcile them. The rabbis talk evident nonsense. And we can get into specific examples that Spinoza uses later, but Amsterdam's People of the Book shows in greater depth that one of the most revolutionary philosophers and critics of the Bible was intimately connected to the ways of reading the Bible that were cultivated and thinking about the Bible, cultivated in the community that he formally left, but never really did leave behind. And I'll finish there, and we can hopefully have some time for questions and answers. Thank you very much for your attention and for bearing with me this evening. Okay, so I will pass the baton back to Rita, and we can hear thoughts from the audience.
Well, thank you so much. We already have a question in the chat. Did Spinoza have any real training in the Talmud?
So
that's going to be very interesting for you to ask.
Yeah, it really is. So the school system in Amsterdam, we can start with a social historical oriented question. The school system in Amsterdam, its distinctive characteristic is that it is overwhelmingly oriented toward the study of the Bible. It's divided into 7 classrooms, and only when you reach the 2 highest ones do you begin to study rabbinics. Earlier on, you're taught how to read the Bible, you're taught how to translate the Bible, you're taught how to chant the Bible, comprehensively. You're taught how to comment upon the Bible. You learn a little bit of Rashi's commentary on the Bible. Spinoza drops out of the school system to earn a trade, to learn, the family business, before he ever sets foot in the classrooms where he would learn rabbinics. And in fact, he even remarks in his key book, the Theological Political Treatise, that he was steeped in the common beliefs about the Bible from childhood on, in a kind of almost autobiographical reference to his education. And if you look at his library was inventoried on his death. And there's virtually no rabbinic literature. He has a couple of mathematical related rabbinic texts. He has a Latin introduction to Talmud for Christian beginners. But his education in the community was biblical. And that is key. I think that's a key contribution of Amsterdam's people of the book for understanding Spinoza and why he does what he does.
And we also have a question by our colleague Alaire Stolsmith in the chat about the part of the rabbinical traditions of the tendency to reconcile the contradictions of the Bible. Was the tendency to reconcile the contradictions already part of the rabbinical traditions, or was it in any way a result of the Enlightenment thinking?
Yes, absolutely. No, the desire to reconcile biblical contradictions is present in rabbinic literature from the Talmud to Menosha's own days and to probably sermons given on Sabbath all over the world. And any reader of Menachem ben Israel's Conciliador could see that, because the way that he reconciles biblical contradictions is by using the way that the discussions of them in rabbinic literature. And in fact, Menachem himself printed in it. Menachem was sort of got no respect in the Amsterdam community. They gave him one of the lower ranking rabbinic posts. They never paid him enough. He was even once briefly excommunicated. So he had to do lots of things to earn a living. And one of the things he did was he was a printer. And he printed a book called the Nomologia by Isaac Aboab, an Italian scholar, Isaac Aboab. It starts off with a list of 10 contradictions that the author considers. But then the book goes on to do all kinds of other interesting things. But what Menachem did that was unique is developing a 4-volume collection entirely devoted exclusively to these contradictions.
Yeah. We have another question about someone asking whether you can talk about the connection with English Protestants and how significant was England's readmission of Jews in the 16th.
Okay, that's a wonderful question as well. It's interesting because the person who has the most connection to England is obviously Menosha, who goes over to England in the 1650s to advocate unsuccessfully, at least formally unsuccessfly, for the legal readmission of Jews to England, since they had previously been expelled in medieval times. But the place, ironically, where I see the most connection to maybe things going on in England is Soli Mortera. Because one of the things that Soli Mortera is really excited about is the possibility that he can convince Christians going back to the meeting that he had with that radical Protestant, this opens up his mind to the possibility that Mortera could possibly convince Christians to adopt religious perspectives closer to Judaism, the opposite direction that we would normally think. And what Mortera is most excited about is trying to convince Christians to adopt the Jewish Sabbath. And he talks about how much John Calvin, the Protestant theologian, extols the importance of the Sabbath. And yet, mainstream Protestants had not yet gone in that direction. Now, the connection with England is that England is the place where you can find Protestants experimenting with Saturday Sabbath observance to a greater degree than many other places on the European continent. And Mortera writing his later work, Mortera writing about the importance of Saturday Sabbath observance in his later writings of 1660, that's already when Menosha has had a chance to go over to England. Now, Menosha and Mortera were not on great terms. They didn't get along. Now, Menosha, Menosha might not have told Mortera face to face about Anglo-Protestant Sabbath observance, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't have heard about it.
Ben, we do have a couple more questions. I hope we still have the time to address those. Christian asks, can you talk a little more about the ways that emerging scientific discourses shape the Jewish understanding of the Bible? I know you hinted at this a little, but I'd love to hear more, especially in terms of how this compares to Protestant dialogues with science in Amsterdam.
Sure. So the environment where Menosha is writing when he starts the Conciliador is one where the heliocentric universe, the theories of the sun at the center of the universe, have become a matter of, these are Galileo's famous discoveries and Copernicus's. They have become a matter of public debate, widespread public debate in the Netherlands, almost more so than any other European country of this time period. There are vernacular translations bringing the new science to the educated but not sort of university-style elite audience of the Netherlands. One of the figures, the people writing this literature, generally, one of the things that they do is they sort of confront the parts of the Bible that appear to contradict with the scientific discoveries, such as the narrative of how the prophet Joshua controlled the sun moving across the heavens so that the Israelites could have more time to slaughter their enemies on the battlefield. And they prioritize science. And emphasize that the Bible is not meant to be a scientific handbook. And the Unitarian Christian group. Yeah.
Ben, I don't know if we still have time for the last two questions, which I believe are pretty straightforward, and we surpassed a little bit of our time, but I think it's a pity not to address them. So we have a question about the Guide of the Perplexed and whether it would be present in the Amsterdam libraries that you study.
Oh yes, absolutely. The Guide for the Perplexed is surely prominently in the library of the Portuguese Jews. It tends not to show up in the curriculum itself. It's when they do inventories of the advanced classrooms, it is not on the shelves usually. So the texts that tend to be there are the sort of Spanish Jewish legal classics by Joseph Caro, the Set Table, the Shulchan Aruch, and his other works, the Beit Yosef, the House of Joseph. The one interesting fact is, as much as the Jewish community of Amsterdam published itself, they have so many prolific authors. The library didn't contain a single volume of a living Amsterdam Jewish rabbi, and only 2 volumes by anybody that came from that community. One was a book of sermons by Saul Levi Mortera that shows up in the library after his death. And the other is a small book by a rabbi named Jacob Jules Leon about Solomon's Temple. So it's really, the library was a monument to Jewish classics, not the kind of newbies of the Amsterdam Jewish community. And Maimonides surely had his place on that shelf.
Yeah. Well, our last question is really vast, but maybe we could close with it. And sure. We have someone asking, what do you see as the most lasting impact of this period, of the activity of these men?
Of this, of the community, of the Jewish community?
Well, maybe the person would like to clarify the question a little further.
Well, what I was asking was the impact on the evolution of Judaism, on the Jewish thought. What impact did it have? And it wasn't exactly biblical criticism where they got to the point where who were the authors of the biblical text, and it hadn't gotten that far, did it? I mean, was that a prelude to that kind of discussion?
So there's two great sort of ways that I think about the larger importance. This is a wonderful question for the end of the session. I've already talked a little bit about how they set the stage for Spinoza in so many ways. There are others as well. Mortera offers a really fascinating and sophisticated historical critique of the New Testament, drawing on information about the Greco-Roman world and the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks to show the sort of classical substrata of the Gospels. There's the preoccupation with doubts setting the stage for Spinoza. There's the biblical focus of the community setting the stage for Spinoza. But I think also that this kind of biblical tunnel vision that the Amsterdam community has for the Bible in education and rabbinic scholarship and everything lines up very nicely with the way that the Bible similarly emerges as the cultural and religious focus of many Western Jewish communities moving into the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries and beyond. I think there's an element of acculturation. The Amsterdam Jews, like other later Jewish communities, are absorbing this sort of Bible-centric ethos that you see show up in 18th century France, Moses Mendelssohn and the early Jewish Enlightenment in Germany, the kind of Anglo-Jewish version of this, David Levy and his biblical orientation toward Jewish religious observance. And so even though they're not drawing on Amsterdam, they're not doing it because Amsterdam did it, but Amsterdam is the earliest case where Jews are absorbing this biblical ethos from a Christian community around them, and it is reshaping their observance of Judaism. And it happens first in Amsterdam, later in other places.
Well, I think this was wonderful, and I want to thank you all for coming. And our time is gone now. Ben, this was really a great opportunity to hear again about your book. I had a couple of questions, but the time ran out. So I guess we will have the opportunity in our corridor conversations and
sure.
To kind of bring out all of this. I was fascinated by your study of the schools and what they were doing with both boys and girls and the readings of these people. But all of that we can, I am sure, and our guests can read in the book. So again, thank you for coming, and thank you, Ben, for the talk. And we are going to end the session now.
Thank you so much, Rita, and thank you so much, Diane and Jill, Max, for organizing the session. I appreciate all of your efforts, and thank you so much again, Rita.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.